Shalom everyone. In this video we're going to look at claims that were made by Jews for Judaism, and we're going to see what they say about Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 is a very heated discussion between Rabbinic Jews and Messianic Jews, and of course the Rabbinic Jews say it's about Israel, the Messianic Jews say it's about the Messiah. Now let's see the objections that Jews for Judaism has put out on YouTube, and let's see if they stand up to scrutiny, if they indeed disqualify Yeshua in particular, and in general, if it disqualifies the Messiah as the subject.
The outline for tonight is basically, number one, to look critically at the claims of Isaiah 53 referring to Jesus. Meaning, we will look closer at the description given in Isaiah 53 and see whether or not what we know about Jesus lines up with what's being described here in Isaiah 53. The second part of tonight's class is to look in Tanakh itself to see whether or not there is another candidate that can fit as the subject of Isaiah 53. I'd like to start with a general principle when it comes to any kind of teaching, any kind of doctrine, any kind of principle that we want to derive from the Torah, from the Bible. When somebody wants to come along and say that Torah teaches any particular thing, you want to look for at least two basic criteria. Number one, the teaching should be clear. What do I mean by clear? What I mean by clear is that it is a passage that when the average person opens up the Bible, reads the passage, he himself identifies it as the subject you claim it is talking about. So for example, when we talk about the Messiah, and we open up the book of Isaiah to chapter 11, and we say chapter 11 in Isaiah is talking about the Messiah, both Jews and Christians, when reading it, admit that this is clearly a passage talking about the Messiah. Another thing we want to look for is consistency. In other words, corroboration. If you were to say that Isaiah 11 is talking about the Messiah, and somebody were to come along and say, well, I don't necessarily believe that it's talking about the Messiah. It talks about universal peace, it talks about a king, it talks about universal knowledge of God that will happen at the end of ages, but you know what? I don't necessarily believe that this is what the passage is coming to teach. You want to be able to now go and look elsewhere in the Bible for corroboration. Meaning, does anywhere else in the Bible give us a picture of a utopian age that will be an age characterized by universal peace and universal knowledge of God? The answer is yes. There's, for example, Jeremiah 23, there's Zechariah 9, there's Isaiah chapter 2. There are many places, and even in the Torah itself, in the 5 books of Moses, you have Deuteronomy chapter 30, which talk about a time and an age where the Jewish people will be gathered back into their land, and they will prosper, and they will be once again in good relationships.
So according to the rabbi, clear means that the average person should be able to understand what a particular passage says, or else the doctrine that seems to depend on that verse or passage is false or cannot be trusted and should be dropped. That is kind of the gist of the argument that was made. Well, if that's the case, Rabbi, then may I ask you why you follow such an ambiguous teaching as the oral law, the oral Torah? There's nothing in the Torah, not even in the entire Tanakh, that speaks vaguely, let alone specifically, about an oral law given to Moses at Sinai. You demand consistency, yet when we apply the same criteria consistently to the tenets of your own position, you can't even meet those standards yourself. Fact is that some passages are clearer than others, and that is what we have to deal with. So your criterion doesn't work at all, not even if we apply your standards to your own position. Point number 2 was corroboration. Let's see if we can find corroboration for the passage in Isaiah 53. Now, corroboration is not something that is mandatory, but it helps, it helps to clarify certain positions. So this passage is known as one of the 4 servant songs. Okay, we have Isaiah 52 verse 13 all the way up to Isaiah 53 verse 12. That means that there are still 3 other servant songs besides this one in Isaiah 53. It's universally accepted that the other servant songs are to be found in Isaiah 42 verse 1 through 7, Isaiah 49 verse 1 through 6, and Isaiah 50 verse 4 through 11. Looking at the first servant song, we notice that the introduction of the servant. This figure will make God's righteousness known to all the earth. He will proclaim the redemption of God, open eyes, free those in bondage, and be a covenant to the people. Then in the second servant song, we find more details. We see this servant being called Israel, but it can't be about the nation of Israel as a whole. Reading on, it becomes clear that this is about a particular individual amongst the nation. Verse 5 speaks about the servant being raised up for the purpose to gather Israel and to bring them back to God. This is not the task of Israel itself, but it's the task of the Messiah. But it will not go as smoothly as it could, because the servant complains that he labored in vain, that all his work was for naught. Perhaps because Israel won't listen and will not turn initially. So God tells him not to worry, that there is a bigger picture here. He tells his servant that it is too small, too little for the servant, that his labor should be limited to the nation of Israel, but that his labor will go to all the earth, to all the nations, so that God's salvation will go to the ends of the earth. Which means that the work of the servant is the equivalent to God's salvation, not only for Israel, but also for the whole world. Yes, God's servant, the Messiah, will make God's salvation available to Israel and the Goyim. Moving to the third servant song, we find even more details. We learn that the servant undergoes suffering, beatings, humiliation, and all in obedience to God's command. But we also learn that the servant is righteous in all the suffering, and that God is at his side in the final analysis. This means that the servant was despised in the eyes of the people at whose hands he suffers, but not in the eyes of God. The last 2 verses are quite telling, where the servant says that those that don't listen to the voice of the servant will make them lay down in sorrow. With all this in the back of our heads, let's now turn to Isaiah 53, the final servant song. We see everything summed up that we have already seen in the previous servant songs. The servant is being exalted exceedingly, but first going through suffering, and that through that suffering God's salvation is accomplished. So it seems to me that there is more than enough corroboration for the messianic reading for Isaiah 53 after all. As for your corroboration for Isaiah 11, Rabbi, you pointed to other passages like Jeremiah 23, Zechariah 9, Zechariah 2, and you claim that they all teach universal peace. Now, if I'm going to be as hypocritical to your reading as you are to mine when it comes to Isaiah 53, then I could easily argue that this is actually not the case at all. None of the passages you just mentioned, except for probably Isaiah 2, speak of universal peace. Those other chapters speak of an individual that at one point in time will bring peace to Israel, but judge the nations. Who says that it's the same person in all those chapters? It could be different persons. Those chapters all speak of peace in Israel, but not universally. So using your inconsistent hyper-skepticism, I don't see how you find any corroboration for Isaiah 11 at all.